Hello, everyone, and welcome to Jealousy, Envy, and Employee Engagement. I'm Matt. I'm from the Happiness Index. I'll just move us forward just to give us a little introduction to the Happiness Index. So, although broadly we're in the employee engagement sector, we have a platform that measures engagement but also happiness. From a neuroscientific perspective, the way that we explain that is engagement is what your brain needs to thrive at work, and happiness is what your heart needs to thrive at work. And we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. On the right there is the platform that our customers use, and I'll just roll forward for one slide for you to see the universal themes that underpin the platform. There's lots of these themes that we'll be talking about today, and one of them specifically, which is related to this title, will be around relationships. So we're going to take the slides down, and I'm going to go over to my partner for today, Amy, and say, Amy, could you please introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Amy Hopper. I'm a sociologist, ex-marketing agency CEO for my sins, and the founder of TOA Group. And it is a pleasure to be here talking to you today about jealousy and envy in the workplace.
And Amy, just give us a little bit on the group. Tell us what you do, and if anyone enjoys the subject today, like how you can help.
Oh, for sure. So we work in the performance consultancy space. TOA Group, essentially, we remove wellbeing barriers to produce higher performing teams. So it could be anything from empathy in empathy and leadership, all the way through to collective wellbeing and setting boundaries, communication, anything that you find you're having challenges with in your company that underlying have a wellbeing issue. That's what we take care of.
Brilliant. Thanks, Amy. So, yeah, my name's Matt Phelan. I'm co-founder of the Happiness Index. And we, as I said, we're an employee engagement and happiness platform. And the data is often where the journey starts. And I was having a chat with Amy about something else, and just jealousy and envy is something we see in the data, but it's not something you see webinars on or talked about. So Amy and I started talking about it, and then we kept on talking about it. So we thought, let's put some polls out and see if anyone else is interested in this subject. And it turns out it's quite a big thing that people think about at work, but it's not necessarily something that people talk about. So I'll go to Amy shortly to do definitions, but we just put a couple of polls up on LinkedIn. The first one we put up was, have you experienced a jealous colleague in your career? And 87% of people said yes. And then Amy said, well, it'd be a good idea if we did it the other way around. If we asked the question, have you felt jealous of a colleague? Would it still be the same stats? So we did a couple of polls on this, and it varied from about 50 to 60%. But have you felt jealous of a colleague in your career comes out between 50 to 60%. So interestingly, 87%, nearly 90% of people have experienced a jealous colleague, but only half of people say that they feel that they've been jealous. So Amy,
do we believe that? Do we believe that? Maybe.
let's get into it. Let's get into it. Before we do that, let's look at the difference between jealousy and envy. So for the purposes of today, Amy, we'll let you can set what we see jealousy as and what we see envy as for the listeners. So let's start with envy. What would be your definition of envy?
Okay, that's a really good point, because I think jealousy and envy as emotions, they're kind of used interchangeably, and people don't realize necessarily that they're not synonymous. So when you've got jealousy, you've got envy. Envy as a start is you're looking at a person and you have a desire for something that they have. And it could be tangible, it could be intangible, whether it is, let's talk about the realms of a workplace. It could be that they have a relationship with a work colleague that you really envy, a position, perhaps something that they own. They might speak Spanish and you really, really want to speak Spanish. And it's kind of, with envy, there's this mixture of admiration as well as discontent, but also the idea that almost like a drive that you could also achieve that thing. And whereas we're talking with the reason jealousy is so different is because it's the same. It starts with the desire for the tangible, intangible thing that person has, but there's resentment and there's bitterness and there's almost this feeling of ill will or maliciousness towards the person that has the thing that you want. It can create like sort of suspiciousness, and eventually alienation, whether that's you alienating yourself away from your colleague or alienating that colleague away from you.
That's really useful, and even when you're talking, I can think I think in my entrepreneurial journey of a situation where I was envious, and actually it I would say it then went into anger, which drove to action, which was I always felt like I wanted to start a business, and then one of my closest friends started a business, and then I got angry at myself because I was like, why have I not done that? And it
Yeah.
was interesting because I was envious, but it gave me that like kick to do what I need to do what I needed to do. On jealousy, I think we can make all the listeners feel a lot better here. I think as we're all human beings, I think we should just assume for today and ignore the data and assume for today that we've all felt jealousy.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
because I just think I think for our listeners, I think we should it's anonymous. Nobody knows who anyone's is. So I think we should just all admit we felt envy and we have felt jealousy, despite what the polls say. But the data is a good starting point
Yeah.
for conversation. And so, Amy, thanks for setting out those definitions. One thing we talked a lot about, and one thing that happens, we talk about at the happiness index, which I did my TEDx on, is the danger of what I call toxic happiness and the danger of labeling emotions as negative or positive. Amy, you've done some work on that and some views. Why do you think it's dangerous to label emotions as negative or positive?
The thing about emotions is that this is what I try and teach in my workshops, is that emotions are just emotions. And we've just given an example there of envy, and envy would normally perhaps be perceived as a negative emotion because but as you've quite rightly said, it can cause inspiration and a drive to go and make a change. That person speaks Spanish. I really want to speak Spanish. I'm going to go and learn Spanish. I'm going to take Spanish lessons. And the same with anger. Anger often gets a bad rep as a really negative emotion, but actually it is a sign to us it's time to set a boundary, or it's our alarm system that someone has encroached on our values. And
Yeah.
there's a really brilliant book by Gabor Mate called The Myth of Normal, which actually suggests that if we don't healthily express our anger as just an emotion, that we can actually lead down the route into high cortisol and a number of chronic illnesses and inflammation such as arthritis, cancer, and all of these other diseases. And the idea that you quite rightly said about toxic happiness, in that like, oh no, it's fine, I'll just be happy, it doesn't matter, it's fine. You're actually suppressing, you're invalidating, and sometimes even gaslighting yourself into this idea of I don't need to feel these things because they are bad, when actually it's just normal human emotion. It's neither negative nor positive. It's actually just emotion. It's your reaction and the situation that comes from it that you as a person are applying the idea of negative or positive to, not the emotion itself.
Yeah, I think that's super fascinating. I think the way we go with it, the happiness index is the sort of geeky version of that, which is we see emotions as data points. And if there was any other data point in your business that was so powerful, you just wouldn't ignore it. So, what are these data points telling you, and what can you do? One thing I hadn't heard before, which I just want to pick up on, please, Amy, as you said, it could be a sign that someone's encroached on your values. That's an interesting one when we're working in a diverse environments. How do you? I suppose I've got two questions. One, can you just expand on that a little bit? And then the follow-up question will be that how do we manage this where we've got lots of people from lots of different backgrounds with lots of different values? So first bit, can you just expand on that? Because I think that's super interesting.
So, but I was always, I had a really, really great therapist who I was saying, I don't want to be angry. I don't want to feel anger. I don't, almost like I was fighting against it. And I was just back when I had this idea as well that anger was a negative emotion. And she said to me, no, anger is a good emotion. It tells you when you need to set a personal boundary, or it tells you when someone's impacted your values. And I told her an example of when I felt anger. And she said, yes, it was a person that had lied. And I felt anger and I wanted to express anger. She said, no, well, that's because telling the truth and being honest is one of your values. And the fact that this person has lied to you, that has made you angry. because you're thinking to yourself, or perhaps my perception of this person was wrong. Perhaps I can't trust them. It has shaken your foundation of what you thought of that person. And it's either a signal that to understand, think, okay, well, maybe I need to have a conversation with this person. Maybe I need to understand what they meant by that. Did they have a reason for lying in this case? And further establish how you move forward in a relationship with this person, knowing that they have the ability to lie. So that's how she sort of framed anger for me in terms of it actually being almost like a mini warning system for relationships and better communication.
Yeah, that's so helpful, Amy. And then onto the second bit, I think this is where a lot of companies struggle, where they sort of like write 5 bullet points down and say they're their values and write them on the wall. And then at the same time, they talk about bringing in a diverse group of people and belonging and all this kind of things. Like, how do we even start on that journey? Because we could have lots of people stepping on each other's toes of their values. Like, where do we start?
I think it's the when you're talking about a company's set values, they're normally like big overarching ideas that will involve inclusiveness and working hard and working together in teamwork, which I think most people can get on board with. And they're not going to be perhaps specific values that go against someone's upbringing or heritage or background. When we're talking about, say, I had a client where they had a difference in opinion based on whether someone was rude or not. And it was just a different way of communicating. I think as long as the main thing when we're bringing in people from different diverse backgrounds, different ways of communicating, different language barriers, and we're giving people the benefit of the doubt that people are trying to do their best and not acting with malicious intent. And sitting down and having conversations rather than making assumptions is always the first port of call.
Yeah.
Noticing those triggers and thinking, I didn't like how that person spoke to me, it makes me angry, but then starting with communication, giving that person the benefit of the doubt and sitting down and having that conversation is always how I would advise a team to move forward. Because again, this is how we then get into toxic work environments, assumptions, jealousy, envy, because it's normally just people just not talking to each other.
Yeah, I was at an event recently, and a HR director was talking about how she had a very fixed mindset of looking at the world and as like right or wrong. She said as her career moved on, she had to learn that two people can have two separate truths, and but it also doesn't mean one person's lying.
Yeah.
She said she used to be like trying to figure out, she felt like she was the HR police and she had to find out who's right, who's wrong, and who's telling the truth. Whereas now it's normally a conversation around, well, when you did this, this is how that made me feel, which is two truths in one moment. But it's she said that was a huge development curve for her, because we sort of all grow up with Disney, don't we, where it's like this is right, this is wrong, but the world's not like that.
That's a really, really good point. And there was an amazing example of that. There was not kind of jealousy and envy related. I did a workshop on imposter syndrome, and I was talking to these two directors of Virgin O2. Really, really lovely guys, really, really open, showing a lot of vulnerability about how they felt imposter syndrome. And both of them shared the same example in the same meeting when they were both talking to each other, how they both felt imposter syndrome towards each other.
Wow.
One thought, oh, this guy's amazing. He knows exactly what he's talking about. He sounds brilliant. Oh my gosh, I need to get to his level. And the other guy was thinking exactly the same thing about the same person at the same time. So both envious of, like, isn't that?
Yeah, yeah, that's absolutely fascinating, is it? Because I've had so many people message me about Inside Out 2, the movie. Have you been to watch it?
I haven't. I'm due to go to see it with my sister on Friday because I thought the first one was just fantastic.
It's so good, and I've had so many people message me go, "Oh, that's like what you guys do at the Happiness Index, isn't it?" And it's like we've been trying to explain to people for 10 years what we do, and a movie comes out and people finally get it, which shows that we need to get better at explaining what we do. But when you were talking, I was imagining the characters in both of their heads,
Yeah.
because what's happening versus what's happening in the head, which is it's absolutely fascinating, isn't it?
It is, and it shows us the each person's perception of reality and what's actually happening, and their narrative of reality is completely different. depending on your
Yeah.
reaction. And that's why we say
Yeah.
that jealousy and envy, it's not like there's going to be a situation that's presented to everyone that's going to make everyone feel jealousy, or it's going to make everyone feel envy. It's that person's individual reaction. So to use the example again, someone speaks Spanish and you want to speak Spanish. For someone with a growth mindset, that might invoke envy, and therefore a reaction, and then someone doing something about it moving forward. Whereas someone with a
Yeah.
fixed mindset, that might evoke jealousy.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I had it with someone that like speaker circuit now for employee happiness and so on. I had it with another speaker. I went up to her afterwards. Her presentation was so measured. I was like, that's what I want to be. That's what I said to her. And that she was probably being polite, but she was like, yeah, but I love your energy that you can put out, that you're outputting, Matt. And I was like, yeah, but I don't want to be like that. I want to be like you. And it's just funny. It was just, it's funny, isn't it? But I looked at her and thought, how could I learn from her? Because there were two or three things that she did really well that just, I think it just calmed everyone down in the audience to get everyone in the zone
Yeah.
to listen, which I just thought was brilliant.
That's fantastic. And I mean, but you're the type of person that, you want to be in a room where you're not the smartest person, so that you can learn and absorb and grow. And there's a brilliant book called Mindset by Dr. Carol Dweck. And she talks
Yeah,
about
I
the
was going to
difference.
ask you about that.
Oh, it's just, and she talks about the difference between fixed mindset and growth mindset. And for me, this feeds perfectly into the difference between envy and jealousy, and so many other human nuances. But if you have a growth mindset, you feel as though your abilities can be changed. You feel as though you can do something and you can work towards something and achieve something else. Whereas if you have a fixed mindset, you feel your abilities can't be changed. So
Yeah.
to me, that's the definition. That's the change, and what emotion, and whether you're going to feel negatively or positively about it.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because I don't have this data on a global perspective, but we do on engagement and happiness. It makes me think, I wonder if certain societies are better at this, because you take in the UK, sometimes people like their careers start to go really well. Stephen Bartlett would be a good example, where lots of people love his podcast, and now it feels like everyone I speak to is like moaning about it and him and everything. I think in England we have this like toxic thing where it's okay for someone to be successful, but we don't want them to be too successful. And I think there's probably a cultural global element to this as well, which we hadn't even planned to talk about that. So I'm meandering now.
No. I mean, I think to be honest, that's another podcast series that we could do on self-esteem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Because if you're self-confident and self-esteem and you validate internally, you very rarely criticize others.
Yeah, very true. I'm now just going to read out, just to move us into the second part. I did some research on the negative impacts of jealousy on employee engagement. So some of these I'll read out, which I think are obvious, but some surprised me. So I'll just read out one, two, three. I'll just read out the top five. Decreased job satisfaction,
Mm.
um, increased stress and anxiety, damaged relationships. This one that's coming up surprised me, but didn't surprise Amy, I think, when we spoke before. Reduce motivation and productivity. I'd always seen jealousy as like the negative impact it would have on the person that is having to deal with someone who's jealous. But actually, in at number four is it actually demotivates yourself if you're feeling jealous, which was a big surprise for me. And then number five, I don't think anyone will be surprised by this, but everyone will understand the cost of it: increased employee turnover. So they're five huge things. But I just want to touch on the reduced motivation and productivity, because it's not something I'd considered, that if employees are feeling jealous of each other, and this would be a good time to bring up the jealous cat meme, which we're not going to do, but I'd ask everyone to go and Google it. But it's where one cat's getting stroked and the other cat's really jealous. And I think reward and recognition programs do this all the time,
Yeah.
where one person gets rewarded and everyone feels jealous. So we could even have scenarios in companies where their reward and recognition program is actually demotivating people because it's driving jealousy.
Yeah.
But can you just, any thoughts on that reduced motivation point, Amy?
Well, that we see that all the time, and as part of preparing for this podcast and the conversations we've had, I've been doing every quarter, the TOA group, we do sociological research, and it might be in a certain industry, it might be a certain subject, but we took this quarter, we took 45 different digital agencies, asking them a range of questions about the challenges they were currently having, marketplace, etc. And not necessarily talking about jealousy and envy, but broaching it from different angles. And one of the main challenges that came up in terms of not necessarily in their businesses at that time, but a story of when they had been jealous, was actually they would take when they had a team leader or a manager or a director who seemingly wasn't pulling their weight, or was taking seemingly wasn't as qualified as they were, or just wasn't doing, perceivably wasn't doing as much as they were. And it kind of gave them the idea of, well, what's the point? Why am I? And I'm sure we've all had that. We think we've got this person who's managing us, who's getting paid more than us, and we're thinking, oh well, I could do their job, or I could be in their position. And so instead of thinking, oh, I'm going to do even better and get promoted, they're just going, why should I be doing this? Why am I working this hard to support someone who doesn't care or doesn't motivate me, or isn't pulling their weight? Classic what may be seen as a toxic work culture, or an issue with management, is actually at the basis of it jealousy. And that person's going to be demotivated, probably end up leaving, and they're not going to be doing their best work.
It's fascinating because even if I reflect on myself in my CEO roles, an example I know of that in the past is when you've got a situation with an employee and I've dealt with it too slowly. One of the things after you've dealt with it, sometimes it's a good outcome, sometimes it's a negative outcome. But I've had so many conversations with people, then they say, I'm so pleased that happened because that was demotivating me. Because you think often when you've got a performance issue with an individual, or a cultural issue with an individual, whatever, you're thinking about it there and maybe their immediate team, but you're not necessarily zoned in on the impact it's having across the organization, where someone's like, that person is just like not setting the standards here. And you think about it from that individual's perspective, but it's the increase you get afterwards when you've dealt with it, because everyone goes, thank God. Thank God that change was made, or that person got help, or whatever it is. But it's whenever that is fed back to me for employees, it's just a reminder how you've got to get onto these issues quickly, and hopefully you can resolve it. Sometimes it means the person's got to leave the organization. But actually, if you don't deal with it, it can result, as we can see in the things earlier, it can release and turn up. You can lose good people over this.
Absolutely. And the thing is that you're talking about an example in which really wonderfully your team are self-aware enough to know that it was affecting them. Sometimes you don't get that, and it's why when we're doing our workshops, even if a company has booked a series and we're doing, say, 6 or 7 workshops covering different themes, the first one is always teaching self-awareness and emotional regulation. Because if people don't know how to recognize what's happening and recognize these feelings in order to be able to go and talk to people about them, or talk to management about them, it's kind of like giving someone a fire extinguisher and not explaining what a fire is. Like you've given them the tool, and you've given them the therapist, and you've given them the work, but they don't know how to recognize the fire. So yeah, really self-awareness is probably one of the most important skills an organization can have for its individuals.
Yeah, I've never heard that fire extinguisher analogy, but I'm going to keep it in my head. And
It's
I'm
mine.
reflecting back.
You can have it. It's mine.
I'm reflecting on times when I've done that as well. So I'm thinking I'm going to keep that in there.
Just tag me in the quote.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the top drivers of engagement, top 4 driver of engagement of what the brain needs is enablement, and that happens all the time. That is where people don't have the tools to get the job done, and sometimes the tool is not specifically it's a tool; it's the training behind how to use the tools, and that's what gets forgotten a lot. I found a brilliant word here that I just want to bring up, Amy. It doesn't get discussed enough at work. So the 5 points I talked about earlier were from the Journal of Economy, Culture and Society. But this is interesting. Deep after those 5 that we talked about, it found that employee jealousy has a direct positive impact on burnout and an indirect negative on job satisfaction, and a word that I think we should use more, vigor. So it's
Mm.
actually that's not doesn't get discussed at work much before, and I thought I better Google the definition of vigor as soon as we're looking at it. Strength of thought, opinion, and expression. Um, Excitement, interest, energy, enthusiasm. I mean, when you think about it like that, if you've got something in the organization that's blocking people's energy is everything, isn't it?
Mm.
So I just want to touch on that on the burnout bit. Any thoughts on that, Amy?
Well, completely, because as we were talking about in terms of whether you've got jealousy, you're perhaps not wanting to feel it, and it's invoking a negative reaction within yourself. Whether we talk about it from a psychological, like, or biological perspective of having high cortisol, and that then impacting one's health and stress levels, all the way
Yeah,
through to alienation, and in terms of the sociological workplace environment, of whether you're alienating yourself from someone or you're being alienated from others, that's going to create a high stress environment. It could be that you're suppressing and invalidating and gaslighting yourself. There's the expense of true feeling and emotion and vulnerability, which
yeah,
can only lead to poor mental health and burnout. That
yeah.
is the classic direction that goes in.
Yeah, I hadn't heard gaslighting used that way round before, but gaslighting yourself is
Oh yeah.
obviously used in a manipulative partnership way quite regularly, isn't it? But to actually gaslight yourself, Eddie, can you just touch on what you mean by that, and any examples, Amy?
A really good example is, so as well as being managing TOA group, I'm also a motivational speaker due to a number of challenges that I've had, car crash, titanium fusion, etc., etc., etc. So when I
Yeah,
do motivational speaking, there is a lot of trauma in my story that I talk about in order to set the scene of this is how I overcame these challenges. And I
mm,
make it very, very clear in those talks, this is not about Amy's been through all this stuff, so what I'm going through is not worth worrying about. It's not about saying, almost gaslighting yourself into saying, oh, my problem today, oh, it's nothing,
yeah,
because there are greater things. There's children starving in the world, so me
yeah,
making my mortgage payment isn't enough. It is something. And it's about
yeah,
recognizing that our thoughts and feelings are valid, that we should
mm,
sit down and feel them, that we should spend the time feeling them. And our 10 out of 10 is our 10 out of 10, regardless of comparing it to someone else. And you're giving yourself a false narrative of your reality. You could get into this idea of toxic happiness, where you're saying, oh, everything's fine. It's
yeah,
not. And it's
yeah,
okay for it to not be, because
yeah,
that emotion isn't going anywhere. So let's sit down and feel it, let it pass, recognize it, and process it.
yeah. I think there's 3 points on there I just want to raise, Amy. I see companies do that all the time.
Mm,
If I use your phrase, then they're gaslighting themselves.
mm,
Um, where they're not necessarily admitting some of the stuff that's going on because they don't want to face into it. Um, we have a really fun thing that I had a neuroscience Clive a question that he asks us, which brings this out, which I really like, which is, and anyone listening could do this with their teams afterwards if they enjoyed it. Amy's point around whether you're gaslighting yourself. The question that we ask ourselves is the story you're telling yourself about yourself more important than the truth? Question mark. And it's a great thing to do as a team activity,
mm.
and it really brings. Like, I'll give you an example of one thing that I used to say that wasn't true. I used to say I hate swimming. That's what I used to say. What the truth was, I wasn't very good at swimming, and I needed to go and get some lessons.
Yeah.
But that I told myself that story over and over again for so long, but I just couldn't admit that I was rubbish at swimming, which was something that happened at, like, when I was 10 years old.
Mm.
But then eventually, when I had my own children and I saw them learning to swim, I thought, oh, actually, you can just do that.
Yeah,
But that's just like
because you were envious and it drove you into action.
yeah, exactly. But my ego was getting in the way. My
Yeah.
ego was making me lie to myself. Where as swimming, one, it can save your life and it's good for your well-being. There's no downside to learning to swim. Um, so I just want to go in the last 10 minutes. I just want to go into how we can help organizations here. So we always get feedback. We want to be living, we want to leave our listeners with some takeaways. So I've got 4 areas that I just want to talk around where I think organizations can start to positively impact this area.
Mhm.
And you've mentioned this word twice, and I think it's 50% of the antidote. So point number 1 would be promoting fairness and transparency. You used that in your personal story where it annoyed you, but we can also see that there's a link there to turnover, isn't there? If people don't think this is fair, they're
Oh,
going to
yeah,
leave.
exactly. There's a link
So
to there's a link to the bottom line, essentially.
yeah. So any thoughts on promoting fairness and transparency, Amy?
I think that for each organization, it's incredibly different and it's got to be unique. But there's no one size fits all. But at the heart of it is communication. Always
Yeah,
communication. And it doesn't
yeah,
matter whether that is talking about personal development and your one-on-ones, all the way through to when you're trying to implement change, which is, as ex-CEOs or like we know is very, very difficult. If you don't get people involved in the process and you don't communicate effectively enough, it's not going to happen.
yeah.
So yeah, that would be the number one thing I would say from
So that is a good segue to point number 2,
Mm,
which that we're offering the listeners is to create safe spaces to communicate,
mm.
which sounds great, but I'm going to ask you, Amy. So one way that you can create safe space, obviously anonymous surveys and so on. That's part of it. That's what we do. But generally, how do you create like safe spaces for organizations to communicate? Like, how do we get to a point where 5 employees come forward and say, you know what, I'm jealous of this person who doesn't seem to have any skills or work very hard, but they're there not on merit. Like, how do we do? I suppose how and do we want people to come forward and say that? I suppose 2 questions in there.
From my experience, if you're going to foster that type of really, really open communication, it comes from the top down.
Yeah,
And it comes from a management style that is not in its tell phase, but in its collaboration phase. And in terms of creating a safe space where people genuinely feel psychologically safe to feel seen and heard, is all about management getting involved in that process. I mean, we facilitate that because sometimes you do need someone to come in from the outside. Sometimes people are just
yeah,
not going to talk to their manager no matter what, and almost that person coming in from the outside, people think, oh, okay, I've got permission. I've
yeah,
got permission, but the management need to be in on those sessions and also need to show their vulnerability as well,
yeah,
because vulnerability breeds vulnerability, and
yeah,
if higher level are doing it, then juniors and entry level they're going to feel that they can do the same without punishment and without judgment.
yeah. I find that fascinating because I wouldn't call it secret shopping, but because of what I do, wherever I go, I just generally ask the employees what it's like working there. I I do my subject, but I'm interested in my subject as well. And
Yeah.
I know there's a massive gap there because, and my family and friends get annoyed because sometimes I'm there an hour later just listening to one person. I've only asked them one question, and they're literally just download on you, and it's like I'm there. I've asked the question, so I'm happy for that to happen. But part of me, when I'm thinking, is you're telling me this because nobody else has actually asked you, so
Yeah.
it's all coming out on me, who is a stranger. Where really you want that to be discussed so you can move forward. Which takes on to the third point, which you mentioned around a collaborative culture. And what I found interesting in your example, where you had 2 people that were thinking the same. How can you foster a collaborative culture, Amy?
That's again a difficult question because it's all based on the company, and at the end of the day we still do have to do a job. I
Yeah,
mean, we'd all rather not be at work.
yeah,
So communication and that collaboration effort, depending on the industry you're in and how traditionally stressful that industry is going to be unique for each one. And whether it is a case that you are regularly putting out surveys such as your happiness index surveys, whether it's that how you arrange your teams, how you arrange your personal development sessions, how you structure that well, I suppose sociological approach to your business, will be the key, depending on size, industry, stress levels, who those companies then have to work with, etc.
I think there's, I know we touched on the other point related to that, which is the reward and recognition of when people are working together and collaborating versus as individuals, which is a second section on it. I think the fourth point we see as a top 4 driver of employee happiness. So switching from engagement to happiness, which is the final point to leave everyone with, is providing opportunities for growth.
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
I often find that myself, especially in the happiness index, and I think this is the same of every organization, in today's world where there is so much learning potential online and in the world in general, I always think if someone can't see an opportunity for growth, it's a lack of creativity from our side. Because if you think about the happiness index, like the opportunities for growth are endless. And if one of my employees feels that there's not an opportunity for growth, it's on us, because a lack of creativity that we've not been able to. If you think like apps like Coursera, you can go and take a Yale course on happiness, like for free, and get a little certificate at the end that they charge you $15 for if you want to do that. So the opportunities are all there in the modern world. And I think it's on us as leaders to be able to point people, because people get obsessed with the hierarchical, are you going to get promoted? But we see in the data, it's rarely that. People always think it's going to be money and promotions.
Yeah.
But most people's brains are scanning, right, where are the opportunities to grow? And if you can provide that, you fix one of the main reasons that we see people leave organizations.
100%.
Any thoughts on that, Amy?
Well, yeah, because you have to know how your employees want to be motivated. And again, this is kind of why we got into the performance consultancy area, because there was this idea that you've got to almost treat your entire team as though they're a football team, or as though they're an Olympic team, and that everyone wants to win and everyone wants more money and no, they don't. Your team is made up of a huge variety of different individuals with different backgrounds, heritage, mindset, personality types, attachment styles, like communication styles, all with different goals and values. And some, like Susan in HR, does not want to win the Premier League. She wants to come in, probably do a good job, earn a fair wage, be treated with respect, go home and see her children. And so again, knowing what motivates your team, and whether that is money, whether that is more time off, whether that is having a more flexible work schedule. I think it was Dell recently that they said to a lot of their developers, a lot of their team, and one of their offices in America, like, all of you've got to come back into the office now. And they all just, no, we're not doing it. And they said, okay, well, if you don't come back into the office, when you're going to be taken off the route to promotion. And 50% of them just went, all right.
Yeah.
Because they didn't care. They didn't want the promotion. Like, working at home was more important to them. So that's definitely a key point. And again, going back to, sorry to keep on going back to these sort of performance and one-on-ones you have with your manager in this communication. If you treat someone like a number and you just treat them as, okay, we're going to go towards these figures, congratulations, you got that figure, you got more money. If you don't actually have a conversation about what motivates them and what they want to achieve in their life, that's never going to, you're not going to get the best of your team.
That never goes out of fashion, does it? And I even have to remind myself to do that with my team, which is just remember to find out. And also, I mean, maternity leave is one of the most extreme versions of someone fundamentally having a huge shift in 9 months. But it doesn't have to be someone on maternity leave to totally change. The pandemic changed a lot of people, or what they want from life and so on. So you've got to be rechecking in with your team if they're going through a big event, like a baby. But it doesn't need to be that. Someone could have any kind of event. You've been through huge events, Amy, but it could just be a total shift in someone's mindset, and you might be aligned and set up to look after them in the way that they don't want anymore.
Exactly. And another point on jealousy is related to what you've just said. There's a hell of a lot of media attention on people saying, that Gen Z don't want to come back into the office, and all they're lazy workers and they care too much about mental health and this and that. But actually, I think the although some of that is true, and there does seem to be a shift in what people think work is, I believe a huge foundation of it is jealousy, and that you've got directors, managers, the C-suite that are of an older generation jealous that the newbies coming through are not having to do as many hours, that they're getting better care, that they're not having to work themselves to the bone to burn out in order to progress, that they seem to have a better work environment and more opportunities and better treatment that they had. It's almost like this idea of, well, I cut my teeth and I had to do my 70 hours a week, so why don't you? And I believe that jealousy is actually fostering a lot of the toxic rhetoric we're getting on this subject in the media.
Yeah, I was at the employee engagement conference in Holborn, and a HR director admitted when they were putting their policies together that they had an element of that in it,
Yeah.
and they recognised it and changed their thought process, which it goes back to what you were saying around understanding yourself, because that is driving it is driving a bit of that. And the reality is that a lot of what we read is political as well, isn't it? So you could see, I've seen the same story reported totally different in different newspapers, one as negative, one as positive.
Mm.
Amy, I'm going to try and sum up. I'm going to somehow try and sum up the last 40 minutes really quickly, and then I'm going to go to you for a final comment. So, just to recap what we've said, 87% of people, which is our poll was about 250 people, said they have experienced a jealous colleague.
Mm.
However, somewhere only between 50 and 60% of people say that they have been jealous. So, again,
Liar.
even as someone who works in data is just the starting point to have good conversations. That's the way I always see it. So that's our opening point. I think Amy's definitions broadly are the difference between envy and jealousy. They both start in similar places of us having feelings towards someone else or an event. But envy is where we use it positively, and jealousy is where it can become negative for the other person. But we also touched on how it can actually be negative for yourself and actually hit your own motivation. I think everyone check out, Amy mentioned Dr. Carol Dweck. I think people should check that out. And just going into the 4 summary points, which is what we can do about it, which is promoting fairness and transparency, number 1, encouraging open communications, number 2, fostering a collaborative culture, number 3, and providing opportunities for growth. So I hope that summed up our discussion, Amy. I'm sure I've missed lots out. But Amy, let's do a couple of sentences each. What's your final thoughts?
My final thoughts is that we should stop being so hard on ourselves. Admit that we are all flawed human beings with a variety of different emotions and mindsets, and every single person is in the same boat. And when you sit down and have a conversation with everyone, you realize that, and vulnerability breeds vulnerability, moving towards a better environment for everyone.
Yeah, I love that, Amy. I just had 2 points. Think like that HR director, that when you're getting these emotions, that's what I mean by data points. If you're feeling something, just try and think, I wonder why I'm feeling that. Is that useful? And could I use that? And sometimes you might not be able to. It's not a problem. And my final point is, I've really enjoyed today, Amy. If anyone's listening and they want a follow up and they've got subjects to follow up, we were talking about off air with our head of events how lots of webinars have all got the same boring titles. So if there's one specific part of this you really want us to drill into, message Amy or me, and we'll just jump back on and record it, because although this is partly very related to our work, this is of huge interest to us. So I'll finish by saying 2 things. Thank you to everyone that has listened to us. And Amy, thank you for coming on and just helping unpick this really complex area.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and such an interesting subject, and one which, like so many of my clients and colleagues, are really looking forward to this podcast. So yeah, it's been great.
Thanks, Amy.
Bye.